Hello, my name is William Price. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at Ball State University, and today I will be talking about post-industrial working landscapes. Hello, and thank you all for joining us today. I must say it's a great pleasure to be speaking with you. Kind of a professional thrill, really, as like both of my colleagues, I rely a lot on industrial archaeology in my own work. If you can see my bookcase with a better camera, I have a lot of industrial archaeology books behind me, and it's with the coffee pot, so you know it's really important to what I do in a day-to-day basis. But my name is William Price. I'm an assistant professor of geography at Ball State University, and my focus is going to be on the middle section of the book. As a tourism geographer, my focus is very much on working landscapes and how communities present and preserve their industrial legacies. And I'm going to be talking about essentially chapters 5 through 8 in the book. And I'll talk about each of them in turn as I get to them in the presentation. As Amy was talking about, with deindustrialization came many changes to communities. For many, industry was their primary source of employment, jobs, investment. It was integral to their infrastructure. And when industries began to disappear, began to move away, many communities saw high levels of unemployment, infrastructure began to decay, leading to a lot of what many of you do in your own work. And Ball State University is in Muncie, Indiana. Some of you may be familiar with, because in the 20s and 30s, it was a feature point of many famous sociological studies as the kind of prototypical middle town of the US as kind of an industrial community. And so every day as I drive to work, I see some of these legacies of what I was just talking about, of what happens when industry moves out of a community that relies so much on it. And that can include also outmigration and just a loss of identity as what had been sort of the unifying factor for the community. And one of the things that's really going to be the focus of my talk is how communities have not been passive recipients to these changes, that they have responded to deindustrialization with creativity, with passion, and with innovation. One of the faces of these responses has been industrial tourism, which has had several incarnations, but the way we think of it contemporarily kind of started in the late 40s and early 1950s, out of individuals very much like yourself who had passions for industrial archaeology. And it evolved to take many forms, but often is associated with visits to present and former mines, factories, power plants, worker housing, sites of transportation. And tourists are drawn to these sites for many reasons. Many of them, like yourselves, just share a real passion for industry. Some of them, it's the history, it's the stories, it's the unionism. For others, it's just fascination in specific types of machinery. I think we've all probably encountered people that just really love, winding engines or certain kinds of drills or all kinds of things that draw people to them. It's been found time and time and again that people that visit these sites have personal connections, maybe themselves or their parents, their grandparents, or someone in their family or their friends used to work at a coal mine or worked in a factory, and it's an important part of their enduring legacy. For others, especially from post-industrial eras, industrial sites represent kind of a nostalgia, a longing for a past that they think of as being more prosperous or more cohesive, but something about that allures to them and continues to cause that reflection. Communities turn to tourism for numerous reasons. One of them is, just like Amy was talking about, is it gives people a chance to use those memories and collective identities and, in a sense, operationalize them, using them as catalysts for attractions and a chance to preserve and promote those community identities and histories. Tourism does offer numerous economic benefits. Tourism is lauded across the spectrum because it's very good for benefiting other sectors. And so an attraction based on an industrial site will benefit hotels, restaurants, retail, and also things you might not expect like construction, education, agriculture. But it's important to note that in many instances, tourism generates a small fraction of the economic impact that the associated industry did. We may be talking 25 or 50 jobs working at the site, or even less, maybe a couple of hundred or thousand jobs supported in the community, as opposed to the tens of thousands of people that might have worked in a mine or within a factory. Another benefit of tourism is addressing environmental issues. As we all know, many forms of industry are associated with toxic chemicals, with various forms of pollution, water and ground, and tourism provides an incentive to clean those up. You can't very well have people visiting a former mine if it's still suffused with mercury and cyanide and all sorts of unpleasant chemicals, to say the least. I find it interesting that when we talk about industrial heritage, it really does run the gamut in terms of that which is celebrated and that which is forgotten. On the one hand, you have sites that are turned into national museums, UNESCO World Heritage Sites, as kind of statements of these are significant, not just for local communities, but for all those who live in a culture or the entire world in the case of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. But on the other hand, we have sites that are largely forgotten. And one of the chapters in our book by John Baton is very much a consideration of that his chapter is about this huge iron ore concentrator, which was at one point the largest in the world, had an enormous economic impact and an impact on the landscape. And yet after its closure, it kind of disappeared from consciousness. And the area that it was has been turned into a recreational site, after fishermen and hikers, not those interested in industrial archaeology or heritage. And so his chapter talks about how geography can be used, specifically historical GIS and story maps, to bring these legacies to light, and that just because something has disappeared from the landscape, at least ostensibly, doesn't mean that its impact has failed. And he talks about in the chapter that the presence of absence, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, it's a concept that comes out of anthropology, that just because something isn't visible anymore doesn't mean that it doesn't continue to have effect on culture, on the landscape, and on the continued identity of people. When it comes to tourism attractions, for many that visit these heritage sites, it may be their only exposure, or at least their first exposure, to the associated industries. They may not have any prior knowledge of coal mining or textile mills or steel production or whatever type of industry it's referring to. And so the interpretation of these sites takes on great importance as it shapes their knowledge, it shapes their perception, and hopefully generates interest to learn more about these sites, maybe in joining organizations like your great one. When it comes to visiting the sites, they often have a lot of power in terms of interpretation because they're viewed as being very authentic. They're at sites of former mines and mills, worker housing, railroads. And so the tourists are seeing the actual buildings that comprise the industry. They're seeing the actual equipment that was used in that mine or factory, or at least another one. And many of these sites also, especially if they've closed within the recent decades, have tour guides who were former miners or used to work in the factories or the different industrial sites. And rightfully, these sites are a chance for communities to celebrate their legacies, to celebrate their culture and history. But one of the things I talk about in my own chapter in the book, which focuses on the National Coal Mining Museums of Britain in Wales, England, and Scotland, is that they do celebrate the social cohesiveness, the economic benefits that came from coal mining. But they often are silent on the negatives. And even when they do talk about negatives, such as damages to coal miners' health, tragic incidents like Aberfan that resulted in mining accidents that caused massive loss of life, or even the aggressive reaction to unionism in the 80s in Britain, it's always in sort of a positive frame that this drew our community together. It's never in terms of why this shouldn't be perhaps embraced again in the future. And something that I talk about in the chapter, and something that Mark and I have talked about more in another published paper we have in Tourism Geographies, is there's a lot of silence on the environmental impacts of mining. Contribution to global warming, pollution. And so one of the things Mark's going to talk about in his unit in his section, I should say, are those questions of de-romanticizing some of the ways that we view the industrial past. Tourism is, of course, but one of many different ways that in post-industrial spaces are adapted and reused. Retailers, restaurants, some of my favorites, breweries, community centers, art galleries are among numerous other transformations. And one that is explored by Sarals and Luna within our book talks about how an art colony was established in a former textile mill and convent in Catalonia. And it explores how they use the site as inspiration in the past, but they also transform it and have kind of challenged the way that space is used, have used it to share their work and inspire other art communities within the region and around the world. And that by using it as an art gallery, it has kind of challenged a little bit of how the government and many in the area think what post-industrial spaces should be used or what they should look like. And so in this case, as with many others, they often sort of homage and celebrate the past while also looking towards the present and the future. I also wanted to mention something that goes across several of our chapters are those discussions of gentrification that Amy already alluded to. And that for all these projects, many of them, not everyone in the community is included, not everybody in the community benefits. And you will see some of these issues manifesting in the chapters on the Barris, on the chapter on post-colonial industry in India, and some of the others that Amy and Mark will discuss. The last specific example I wanted to talk about from the book is the final chapter in my section, chapter 8, where Donnie explores how it's not always the tangible ways that heritage manifests, but also the intangible. And her chapter discusses how the Lithuanian National Drama Theater developed a play based on the decommissioning of a former Soviet nuclear plant, and how this drama was used where the actors were actually locals, and it's their stories, their memories that form the script, and how the play itself is constantly changing based on how the different locals that are coming into the play, how they're using their memories and evolving them. And for the locals, it's kind of, for want of a better way of putting it, kind of a cathartic experience for them, because they can look to the past and deal with some of those traumatic memories, but it's not always a negative. It's about adaptation, it's about evolution. And it's a chance for them to have pride in their communities, both in what has happened in the past, but also serving as kind of a rallying point as the community moves forward. And so in this case, the drama illustrates how art and other forms of creativity can actually be sources of reflection and healing, and also providing inspiration, like in the previous discussion of the convent and textile mill in Catalonia, for moving forward in positive ways. And so in summary, yes, tourism is sort of the face of post-industrial working landscapes, but by no means whatsoever the only manifestation. And that whatever we're talking about, whether it's tourism, other uses, art colonies, or dramas, post-industrial communities and landscapes are constantly evolving in how they view the past and how they manifest the present. And they're no means moribund. They're not dead. They're active, they're vibrant, which is something Amy hit on so well in her discussion. But it's also important to remember that there were aspects of the past that aren't positive, that aren't something that to be celebrated, but perhaps to be learned from. And as Baton's chapter highlights, it's important not to forget these. And this is a question that my colleague and friend Mark is going to explore in his discussion to follow me on de-romanticizing post-industrial landscapes.